So welcome everyone, good evening. I have the pleasure to introduce Erwin Redl, and it's kind of an extra pleasure because he's not only an outstanding and interesting artist, he's also a friend. That makes it a bigger pleasure. First time that I was running into Erwin's work was at the winter, at the opening of the Whitney Biennial 2002. It was in the winter, I remember, it was freezing cold, and he changed this building of the Whitney Museum entirely from the outside by applying a very beautiful, poetic curtain wall of lights. I was very taken by it, and then it took me a while to figure out who was responsible for this, and then finally I heard about Erwin Redl first time. We've met first, if I'm not mistaken, in the context of the new W Hotel, Hollywood and Wine. Tiffany Lendrum, who's with us today, was the curator, curating a number of artworks. Jennifer Steinkamp was one of them, Pei White, Erwin, and myself. And I think we all consider that it was a very beautiful opportunity, and some really nice work came out of it. And if you want to see it, it's on Hollywood and Wine, this W Hotel, with an exciting, especially for younger people, probably very exciting nightclub and all of that stuff. During that time, I remember we were sitting once together at home having dinner, and Erwin mentioned, we were talking about America and what's good about it and what's not so great about it, and then he came up with this line that there's one place in the United States which is so amazing that no matter what would happen, that should stay the way it is, and it's this little town Marfa in Texas, home of Donald Judd today. What is it? It's a little place in nowhere land with a lot of foreigners, kind of a very beautiful, calm ambience. Even the local pizza joint is kind of outstanding, and you wonder, well, how can that be in Texas? And he had an artist in residence there at the Chinati Foundation, and that introduced him to this place, and so he made it so interesting for us that very soon after, my wife and I, we decided to make a trip to Marfa, and we enjoyed it a lot. Erwin is Austrian, if I'm not wrong, or you're American? No, still Austrian. He studied electronic music, what I found very interesting. So he studied music and composition in Vienna, and then later computer art at the School of Visual Arts in New York. He lived in New York from 1993 until 2007, when he moved to wonderful Ohio. And so now I want to hand over, and I would be very curious, what makes Ohio so wonderful for you to live there? Maybe somewhere in your talks you might elaborate a little bit on that thing. Big question mark in my head. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Well, thank you for that charming introduction. There was this one cartoon in the New Yorker, I think there was an old couple sitting in the Midwest, and they said, now they call us the Heartland, in 2 months we are the flyover states again. And Ohio is, right now the Heartland, and we'll be a flyover state again. My presentation starts with a little slideshow and a soundtrack. Once you hear the soundtrack, you get some sort of an idea that I will talk a lot about music. And after just a little slideshow in the beginning, I talk about one term that is very important for me. It's reverse engineering. I talk a little bit about one of my or the artist that kind of changed my life, which is Fred Sandbach. And then I have 4 projects that I can introduce you to. It might just go way too long. We might just do the first 2 projects, but then you see a little bit like how I work, how my studio is organized, and different dimensions of that I explore, from space to sound to time. Okay, let's just roll this little thing here. Oops, the sound doesn't play. Oops. Sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, so soundtrack was by John Luther Adams, American composer, actually a Alaskan composer. And he's not related to John Adams, the very famous John Adams, the Bay Area composer. The piece is called Dust into Dust, and they played from minute 5:34 to the end at 9:15. The connection is obvious to my work. because the whole piece by John Luther Adams is just for 4 drums, 2 snare drums and 2 field drums, as they're called. And it's just one continuous, very fast meter that gets distributed over those 4 drummers. And with this very simple means, it's just one continuous, very fast 16 notes meter, a whole universe unfolds for the listener. And I employ a very similar and very simple strategy. I use square grids of LEDs. Mostly, I use very different means right now as well, but mostly I use just LEDs in square grid formations in different architectural, also very different social environments. And by basically radically reducing my grammar and my vocabulary, something else happens. It doesn't happen in this space. It happens in your mental space, in your visual space. And it's not so much about the objective reality of what I create, because most of my work can be described in like 1 or 2 paragraphs. It's what's happening in the viewer. That's for me, it's always the viewer, or more precise, the body of the viewer in the context of my work. It's obviously, it kind of links back into the strategies of minimal art, but also because I work with technology, it happens on a different level at this point, because the vocabulary becomes very different if you can involve time-based parameters, which for me as a former musician, more or less, is a natural medium. Okay. There are just 2 quotes that are worth noting here. One is the simple one: structure becomes program, by the architect Zaha Hadid. And then the one is a little bit longer. It's: in the past, the structure system of a building played only a minor or indirect part in the aesthetic appearance of architecture. Unadorned structure was rarely used as aesthetic form per se or experienced as such. In the present, man increasingly derives aesthetic sensation from the purely intellectual comprehension of a logical system, and hence experiences the logic of structural form as a form of aesthetic sensation. It's a little bit long-winded, but also very obvious in the context of my work. I'm interested in structure. That's why the title of this presentation is, I think, Structures in Time and Space, or Structures of Space and Time. Not spaced out structures, that's something different. The link between music and what I'm doing now as a visual artist is structure. Structure unfolding in space and structure unfolding over time. I tried to get the music score of the percussion piece. Unfortunately, in the last 2 days, I wasn't able to get it very quickly, because it's kind of an esoteric composer. It's not easy to get his scores for the public. But if you just look at scores, it's also timelines unfolding in space from left to right. And if you look at any video editing software or any editing software for music, it's the same story. You have timelines, you have different levels or different layers in Final Cut Pro or any Premiere or any video editing program, and it's exactly the same as in music scores, and or the same as in lighting control software that I'm using right now. Just a little bit about my professional background. I was born in a tiny little village in Austria. And Austria is a tiny little country, and we all know each other. It's just 8 million people. And my family they were carpenters and furniture makers, like 3rd generation, my father. And I was more or less raised to take over his company and run the business and do it. And I never really liked the business, I have to say. But I was sent to this Polytechnic high school that specialized basically in educating people to run a business, plus design. And most people who came to that school were either later on taking over a business or studying architecture. So I had a very strong visual education, also focused on engineering, on geometry, very early, like computer technology. And at the same time, I played obsessively guitar, because kind of an old middle class European tradition is that you have to learn an instrument. My sister learned piano, I learned guitar, and so on. And then it became this kind of instrument, literally and metaphorically, to resist what I was meant to be for my family. And instead of like going into architecture or take over the business, I studied music. Initially classical guitar, and then composition electronic music. And through composition electronic music, which are actually two different departments. At this point, they weren't really connected, but they are two different degrees. Through using computers, I started incorporating visual elements again into my work, because when you start electronic music, at that point it was either you use tape, like old school tape, and you literally cut it with scissors and tape it together. It was a very physical process. It was not sampling, but you sampled by cutting tape and splicing it together. It's a kind of a nice old craft tradition. And or you use computers to write algorithms and create electronic music, or used synthesizers like Moog synthesizers, used patch cables and create different patches for different sounds. And I was more into like the programming end of this trade, and started to incorporate just very simple geometric forms or very high-speed patterns. I actually tried to create color out of just very high-speed black and white patterns, and suddenly I saw myself more showing in a more fine art context, like in university galleries or small little group shows, either with sound art or like having projections or computer monitors involved. And then I saw, well, since I didn't grow up in that fine art tradition on a college level, I didn't have much of a future in Austria, to be honest, because it's a very compartmentalized educational system. And I applied for a Fulbright grant to go to the US and studied at School of Visual Arts in New York from 93 to 95. Oh, yeah, here, one of the key terms that I employ is reverse engineering, and probably most of you know what reverse engineering is. I just read this little quote from my statement. Since 1997, I have investigated the process of reverse engineering by retranslating the abstract aesthetic language of virtual reality and 3D computer modeling back into an architectural environment by means of large-scale light installations. In this body of work, space is experienced as a second skin, our social skin, which is transformed through my artistic intervention. Due to the very nature of its architectural dimension, participating by simply being present is an integral part of the installations. Visual perception works in conjunction with corporeal motion and the subsequent passage of time. I became very frustrated with doing computer art because you program, you spend so much time in front of the screen, and then you create virtual environments, but as a body, as a corporeal entity, you can't be in there. Of course, you can use the simulating technologies of VR with goggles and sensors, but there was just too much limitations to my body to be in a virtual space. And I hit my nose on the screen, like literally and metaphorically. I wanted to be in that world, but couldn't be in that world. And then, that's the official definition of reverse engineering. I jump a little bit forward. I jump to Fred Sandberg first, because in 1997, I was part of the PS1 studio residency program. PS1, which is now part of MoMA, at that point it was a completely separate entity. They had an international studio residency program, and I was the Austrian participant in that program. And Alena Heiss, the director of PS1, asked the residency artists to have the studios open for the big reopening event in '97, because it was under renovation for 2 years. And I said, well, nice, wanted to put my computers up and show a lot of computer monitors, maybe with sound. And then 2 weeks before this opening, I saw Fred Sandberg's work at the Dia Center. Fred Sandberg's work, I've seen it before in publications, but never experienced it as a body in space. And his work is extremely simple. He uses acrylic yarn and stretches it in space in very, 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 very simple geometric shapes, just rectangles, squares, triangles even. And there's a permanent piece at the Dia Center, at the new Dia Center in Beacon, New York. Here there's another installation of his work at David Zwirner Gallery in New York. And here I found this, when I Googled Fred Sandbeck, and I found on the image of somebody just bowing in front of his work, because he became kind of a cult-like figure. And he's, in terms of a bigger context of minimal art, I always call him like a cyan artist. He's not like the blue chip Donald Judd or people of that stature. He's a cyan. He was more in the background, and because of that, he even had more cult-like following. I think I'm going back now a little bit. Okay, here we are. I think, do we all know what reverse engineering is officially? I guess so. Like, you try to recreate an object or software very often without knowing the blueprint of that object or software. And that's the very simple definition of reverse engineering. And I tried to imply the strategies that are used in computer animation, mostly I have to say like early wireframe animation, because it fascinated me much more, that high level of abstraction instead of like those fully rendered environments that you mostly see now in computer animations. And I tried to recreate those environments now in a big architectural environment. And when I saw Fred Sandbeck's work, going back to that story, I just saw that work. Next day I came back to my studio, put all the computers away and started to string little wires from floor to ceiling and soldered LEDs in between. And that's basically what I'm still doing on a different scale, and mostly I don't do the soldering anymore, thank God. But I use more like also controller technology, but it's the same idea of your body in space being kind of tangled in an abstract net, not tangled in a positive way, like captured and also guided by structure maybe. Okay, now to a completely different context and maybe more entertaining context, Kraftwerk. Does everybody know who Kraftwerk is? Yes, thank you. Kraftwerk is also like a cult band from Germany. They started in the early 70s, building their own instruments out of like electronics, and made music that was completely unique at that point. And it's still, I think, actually unique, and now it gets sampled so often, it's almost ubiquitous. But, and what fascinated me for them was that they kind of reversed engineered or twisted the concept of music around. Because there was always the idea, especially in pop music or in rock music, that electronic instruments get anthropomorphized. You know, if somebody plays keyboard, they played keyboard like, it was always like, you know, the emotion was being shown, and they used elbows and or stabbed, like John Lord of Deep Purple stabbed like the organ with a knife, you know, or the guitar hero like on stage, you know, celebrating the solo. And when Kraftwerk came onto the scene, they walked on stage, you will see it in this little video, like robots, they stood there, played their part, and walked away. They said, we don't care about being humans. We want to be like robots. It's much better. And let's just play Kraftwerk then. I hope I can handle this, yeah? Yes. Now, let's see, Kraftwerk. Here we go. Oh, Control F. Yes.
energy. We are the robots. We are the robots. We are the robots. We are the robots. Your function automatic, and we are getting mechanic. We are the robots. We are the robots. We are the robots. We are the robots.
You get the concept, I guess. So, how do I? Very good. Just see, there's another video. Now, this was just the first story of Kraftwerk. Interesting also that Mr. Ralf Schneider, one of the founding members, he is the son of, I don't know his first name, Mr. Schneider Sr., and he was the owner, or still is, I guess, I don't think they exist anymore. Schneider Computer was a very early computer company in Germany. And so he had that knowledge of, from his, basically by osmosis, from his family, and then used that to build his own instruments or control them, because everything you saw here was basically handmade, more or less, by them. And then a later story actually is that, of course, his father didn't approve of his musician career, but then the Schneider Computer was about to go bankrupt like a decade later, and his father asked his son for money because they became multimillionaires, of course, Kraftwerk, because they had this really totally amazing career. They actually still perform, not in that original formation, but there's still one founding member. Also, another story is that two of the founding members actually started with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. I mean, some of you who might be interested in contemporary music, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen is one of the giants of 20th century contemporary classical music, serial music, and like a total giant. It's like a Picasso of contemporary music. And they started with him. So they had the whole, there's something classical music in there. It's this very restrained behavior, maybe also very German, but and then the concept is computer, robot, very disciplined performance. And then on the other hand, now a lot of classical performers play Kraftwerk music live. And now I play just one sample from an Italian band or ensemble, Quintoriggio. And they play the same song, but they play it like a rock band. So it's amplified, and the sound of the string instrument is distorted, like the Kronos Quartet, which you might know, just as a different conceptual leap. Oops, we need volume. Oops, I think here it is. Just an example of appropriation of styles, and just using things in a completely different context. There are endless examples. I don't even want to play them all. You already see here like 2 more video clips. One is Tron, which fascinated me early on because, well, obvious reasons.
I want him in the games until he dies playing.
What was interesting for me is like the seamless
holding area for the
integration
light
of the
cycle.
virtual and
Hey,
the real.
Flynn, you made it.
Wait here.
You won.
Alan.
Where did you hear that name?
Well, that's your name, isn't it?
The name of my user.
He actually is in a computer game now as a physical
How did you
entity.
know?
I'm a program from a user that knows Alan.
He was disoriented in transport, Tron.
Yeah, but I'm remembering all kinds of stuff. Like my user wants me to go after the MCP.
My user wants that too.
I know.
Prepare to transport to light cycle grade. We have transport.
Wow.
This is Blue Leader to Blue Bikes. Run these guys in the
Another big influence was 2001 Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, especially the Stargate sequence, which you just see here briefly. So the premise was always to find this magic intersection, or this threshold that was going back and forth between the virtual and the real, and the abstract and the concrete. Let's just see where we are. I just have to open up a couple of more files. Let's see if I can do this quickly. Yes, I hope I can. I'm not so good on a Macintosh, I have to admit. Okay. Let's just open them up here. Okay, that should do it. Okay. We already had Fred Sandberg. Okay. That was fast. Okay. I'm going to talk about the project from 2010. Project is called Fetch. It's a computer-controlled light installation with multicolor LEDs. And by all means, it was my largest piece so far. It was 517 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 60 feet high. I was part of the show called Six Solos, was basically 6 solo exhibitions at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, curated by Chris Bedford, who is now actually the director of the Rose Museum at Brandeis. And it was arranged through Ace Gallery in New York, in Los Angeles. And it was one of the most fast-track pieces I've ever done. It was probably from start to finish just 4 months or so, or less than 4 months. And one of the advantages of this piece of the location was that it was basically 2 hours away from my studio. So that's the advantage of being in Ohio. The way I want to introduce the piece to you is, number one, show you how I presented the piece to the Wexner people. It was just I created like 3 computer animations, and then show you how we produced the piece, then images, and then we made a long video documentation. Long, it's like 5 minutes or so. Let's just look at the animations briefly. Let's see here. So that as the title says, fetch, something is being fetched. And okay, let me try to find one image maybe. No, that would give away too much. Okay, back to this here. Okay, let's just play this movie here. So you already see what's being fetched here. The idea of fetch was to have a real stick fly through real estate by virtual means on a gigantic scale. So this is from here to here, it's 517 feet, and this is 65 feet high and 12 feet wide. And the Wexner Center for the Arts was one of the very famous buildings by Peter Eisenman, postmodern architect in US. And in front of the museum, he placed this gigantic grid system out of painted steel. Each element here is 11 by 11 feet, or 11 by 11 by 11 feet. And as soon as I saw this building, I said, wow, that's Sol LeWitt. Sol LeWitt, the famous minimal artist, made parts of his career very iconic cube structures out of very thin, I think it was actually painted wood at one point, and also larger pieces. And then suddenly, I don't know who appropriated whom, but then Peter Eisenman has this gigantic grid that looks like a massive blown up Sol LeWitt. And I saw this piece when I drove down to Columbus, and the curator said, yeah, you know what you have to do. And I said, well, I'm afraid I know. He said, you will be outside. And I said, yes, I knew. And well, and also funny was, he thought I live in Toledo, Spain, not in Toledo, Ohio. So that was, so that the drive from Toledo, Ohio was easier than the drive from Toledo, Spain. And I think we met in July of 2010, and the opening was on the 1st of November 2010, the same year. And so I went down there, saw the building, said, okay, fine. And 2 weeks later, I just sent in those animations, and they're like, I think 3 more animations. And this one might even remind you on the Stargate sequence of 2001. So it's just very simple. Each of the top 3 tiers of that grid structure had one light element. I just call it like very neutral light element in there, and they were slightly arranged in different angles. So as soon as I animated that sequence over time, you saw that stick rotating through space and flying towards you. Just now you see all 3 of them flying here. Top tier, middle tier, and the lower tier. So this was the idea, and now I had to make it happen. Okay, so what you see here now, what do you think this is? Well, wrong. Those are actually 2 washers that we glued together to seal the light tube that we actually manufactured. Because initially I thought, well, there must be some LED tube out on the market that I can just control with DMX and just put it up there and I don't have to worry about anything. But wrong I was. I mean, they make LED tubes, but they have only very narrow viewing angles. So because they mount them against the wall, so they don't really care how the wall lights up, they just project forward. But I needed an LED tube or a controllable tube that illuminates 360 degrees. So at one point I said, no way, I just do it myself. And so me and my team, the idea was to create a fixture that looks generic. So it should look like a fluorescent tube. So you don't have you don't attach anything special attention to the light fixture itself. So we just experiment with different frosted acrylic tubes and putting LEDs in those tubes. And now you see my little sweatshop here. And all we did, basically, we got, I think this is a 3/4 electrical conduit, insulated it with a plastic foil, and then glued 5, okay, I just go a little bit forward and backward. All right. And we glued 5 RGB LED strips to those conduits, put those conduits in a tube and sealed it with those little washers that we also glued together. And then, of course, we had to now cable everything up. So this is a 1-to-2 model of one of those cubic elements. And of course, we had to figure out that, like a system that is, survives like a year outdoors, that is flexible, so the wind loads. We had to, of course, to make adjustments. We used a chain system, so we can like have an increment, like a metric of like a 1/2 inch of those chain members, and had to just try it out and hope it works. We obviously had to build a very accurate 3D model of the whole frame structure, and place in that 3-dimensional model a tube and slightly rotate it so it makes those 3 turns per fetch or per throw. And now, so there are 4 pendants. Actually, I have a laser pointer. That's exciting. So there are 4 pendants on every end of of those light tubes. And by just calculating the length of those pendants, I can completely create any position in space. And now this is just cutting chain. Happy workers. And here you see just the raw little electrical conduit with all those LED strips attached to them. And now that's just a big blown up picture of the previous image. And then we had to saw the little cables here, like link them all together, and you can imagine the rest. cable, everything gets cabled up. Then we had just acrylic boxes built to put the power supply outside as close as possible to the light elements, because if you run DC voltage over long stretches, you just have line voltage losses. So we had to place them outdoors. We had to seal the power supplies, and actually not all of them survived. That was actually a miracle. And now electronics, those are off-the-shelf DMX controllers that I get directly from a Chinese supplier, and they all need to get labeled, tested millions of times. They get all the little control LED strips and then now this was the first test. So Chris, one of my assistants, we just drove down to Columbus and put one test element up and see if our computer model is correct. And here you see, and now you see we're putting a level on it. And now we knew that whatever we did was correct, because we just leveled it out. We saw that we had the 4 pendants and it's leveled. So after that first test, we just went into basically mass production of, I think it was like 300 tubes with 300 pendants. They all had to get labeled because it was funny. I was mostly doing spreadsheets, and that's our first test tube. And now this is already the installation for the exhibition. We had a fantastic rigging team that the museum hired. They're mostly rigging for rock shows or big theater stadiums, and they're fearless, which is absolutely necessary. Because they had. Excuse me, the stick is in the exact center of one of these cubic. No, it's not in the well, yes, the center of the stick is in the center of that cube, but then it rotates around that center. That's correct. And so most of the time they could access all the positions from scissor lifts. On some exposed trusses, they had to free climb it basically. When they were climbing all the way up here, and it's very exciting. And we got incredibly lucky in terms of weather. We had only like a half day of rain. The rest was just Indian summer. And here, this is like the first tier is up. And now I think this is 2 tiers up. And here it's all 3 of them, I think, already up here. And of course, then you have to light it up and see if all the measurements are 100% correct, meaning that it actually looks, that it's not shaking. There's not like one is off. And so there was like a first phase of just roughing it in, and then a second phase, and the second phase was all free climbing because they couldn't get a scissor lift in there anymore, obviously. So they had to free climb to just fine tune everything. So the rigging crew basically did all the really exciting stuff, and my crew, we did all the electrical stuff. So can't really see it here, but on those vertical truss members, we just attached those acrylic housings for the power supplies and for the DMX drivers. They were all cabled up with Ethernet cables. They were all sealed and tested. And then, once everything was up, we just ran tests over tests over tests. They all light up, and then there were signal problems, of course, and there were power supply problems. But at the end, there was very smooth production. Thanks to a very good team from the museum, and also a very good team from my side, I think. And the weather was a big factor in this. So just going back 1 second, it always reminds me a little bit on a sailboat. It's a very similar technology to rigging sails. Some of you might sail. I did a little bit as a kid. And this is very thin means. Everything is very just cables, and then you attach things and deal with natural forces in space. And that was always very appealing to me, like these very little things that can change very big things in space for a body at the end. And here now it's lit up. This is shot from afar, from across the street, and we see this is kind of half of it now. And at the beginning, the top tier, middle tier, lowest tier, there's a very short, ground tier that we didn't use because it wasn't enough space for a whole rotation, basically. And yes, this is a major, corridor. So everybody at the university is on the campus of OSU was walking through this every day and night. Oops. So just a couple of shots. And of course, the very, for me, very interesting part is that, of course, every piece has unintended consequences. And the great thing was all the unintended consequences of this piece were extremely positive. I mean, I see this now like as three-dimensional Joseph Albers, because they're very simple square structures. And yeah, you see, it's obvious why it's Joseph Albers. And it was basically running only at night. I mean, they sometimes ran it during the day, but during the day, color LEDs just simply don't read well during the day. I mean, the idea was it's a night event, and it was during the winter time, and they actually extended the duration of the show for another 6 months. It was basically up for 1 year. And I think we had to change one lighting element, which was like amazingly surprising for everybody, in a good way. Okay, now I should play a little documentation video. Let's see if I find it. Should find it. Yes, I do find it. Oh, thank you. Okay. I could ramble on for another like 5 hours with different projects. So the question is like, how much time do you have and how many questions there are? Because I think it's easier if you make it more like car talk, that you ask me questions instead of me just rambling on forever.
I think you could easily go for another 15 minutes.
Okay, good. Then I will go for another 15 minutes. Okay, I just open, let's see, videos. Okay. And we listen to some more music, that's good too. Okay, let's go back to PowerPoint. Another project from the same year, it didn't originate in that year, but I want to talk in depth about one version because I have a longer video documentation about this project. It's called SpeedShift. And the cursor is blinking. I have to press it, yes. SpeedShift, as the title implies, something is shifting and something it has to do with speed. And let's just maybe go 2 slides forward. The first version of SpeedShift was, or is, a permanent installation in St. Louis in a subway station. And it's 2 panels of white LEDs just here above the bridge. And there are 2 other panels on the other side of the bridge that display exactly the same. And what is being displayed is a very simple, just a very simple wave structure. The 2 waves are just running towards each other endlessly. And they start out in a medium tempo, and yes, there's sound in it. And a medium tone pitch just beeps at every top cycle of the wave. So the wave goes beep, beep, like a sine wave going through. And when it becomes faster, the tone pitch also becomes higher, but not like in a glissando, like a sliding tone, but in a pentatonic, a very simple melodic structure. But it's not completely linear, it's a computer program basically chooses the pitch. It says, well, if I go faster, it's more likely that a higher tone pitch is chosen, and same vice versa. If it's lower, it's more likely a deeper note is being chosen. And here's just a very simple, the simple structure, left LED strip, right LED strip. They start at the same tempo with the same pitch. One is speeding up, the other one is slowing down. Fastest tempo, highest tone pitch, slowest tempo, then slowing down, speeding up, going back to medium, and then the reverse direction. If you look at this graphically, it's just they start out with a medium tempo, fast tempo, go basically to a kind of a 0 crossing point, slower, the other one goes faster, and go back. Here just, I made a little graphic notation of a score, same story here. I explained a little bit of a sound background as well. The reason why I'm not using sound is because otherwise it becomes very new agey. It becomes this very idea, like sound and light. And then some people, we want incense now. It's like you have to know where to stop, and it becomes very kitschy. And also the things we have to be aware of, especially with sound is completely rooted in the here and now. Number one, because it's a time-based medium. Number two, we can immediately say this sound is the bass sound of DJ XYZ, or this is the Moog synthesizer sound that was just used by Kraftwerk or by somebody. Or if you have a cello sound, we think about what are the Bach cello suites with Yo Ma. If I play Tibetan gong, everybody thinks Tibet. Nothing wrong with either Tibet or Johann Sebastian Bach, but if I play this one sound, I exclude everybody else. Because somebody say, wow, I want to hear German techno. And I say, great. But somebody else wants to hear Tibetan gongs. So that's why most of my pieces are silent. With this piece, I make the big exception because the sound is very, very just an abstract little beep, and it should reside in that very abstract, time space. It's just white LEDs with a simple wave patterns and very simple, like sine wave beeps. They make beep, beep, like the most simple computer beep. Okay, going back to music. Let's just listen to some music that influenced me, let's just say directly, not even like just subconsciously. Okay, let's just find those pieces. Okay, Steve Reich, one of the...
He began to warn the people. He said, after all, it's going to rain after all.
Just play a little extra.
And the people didn't believe him. And they began to laugh at him. And they began to mock him. And they began to say, it ain't going to rain. It's gonna rain, 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 it's gonna 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 it's gonna
Going a little bit fast forward. And so on and so on. How did this piece happen? Steve Reich studied actually philosophy, also I think also at Yale philosophy, like Fred Sandberg, and was also very interested in music, and also then switched to percussion actually, and traveled a lot in Africa, and picked up drumming techniques that were very unusual, even in the contemporary classical music context, and was an early experimenter with electronic music and tape music. Tape music meaning really tape. I mean, they had reels and they spliced them, and he recorded a street preacher in San Francisco in '65, and just wanted to play. He recorded them in mono, just with a single mono tape, and wanted to play them in like from two speakers in two different rooms. I don't know the exact story, from two tape players. But then when he realized it in his studio, the tape players played slightly different speeds, because it's especially in that analog technology, nothing is perfect. So he started playing, and he says, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain. But then those phases shift apart. It's called phasing, like the music term is phasing. You can buy a phaser for your guitar and everything. It's just the sound and the amplitude of the sound and the time structure gets slightly warped. One is running a little bit slower, the other one is running a little bit faster, and over time, they meet again. At the end, you at one point when I skipped forward, you heard it like it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain. You heard a very direct stereo effect. So they're like halfway through the piece, basically. At the end, it kind of splices back together to the beginning, where you hear like in sync, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain. And very obvious, the relationship is very obvious to the piece that I did here. Another piece, Steve Reich, much later. Let's go back for 1 second. New York Counterpoint, I think it's, what's the year here? Make sure I'm not, 85, so 20 years later exactly. He gave up those tape techniques. He established himself as a, almost like conservative, like in terms of instruments, composer. But he still uses this very fine techniques of things coming in and coming out, and you don't know when they come in and when they fade out. But you hear just two clarinets at the beginning, and then suddenly a second pair of two clarinets comes in and plays a counterpoint along, fades in, fades out, and this whole piece just involves from a very simple structure and then goes back to a nice closure at the end. Let's just continue. Okay. Now you hear two pairs of clarinets. And also the melodic means are very simple. It's just one note is held a little bit longer, and that one instrument basically takes a different route in that meter. bass clarinets coming in. Okay, back to speed shift. Okay. This was the second version of Speed Shift shown at Ace Gallery in Beverly Hills. And at this point, I came up with a kind of a Lego block system. I was kind of an obsessive Lego kid. And we made a tile, a 20-inch long tile out of a circuit board with just 5 channels of, so I have a laser pointer, 5 channels of LEDs here. And they're just wired up in parallel vertically, and I can just control those waves and assemble those Lego blocks in different architectural settings. And here at Ace Gallery, I just used one long wall, and this was a 22 feet long wall, and the other one 22 feet, and they just merged into this corner. The next version of Speed Shift was at the World Expo 2008 at the Austrian Pavilion in Zaragoza. And here I had the chance to work directly with the architect to design the room, not the shape, but we wanted, because the theme was water, the exhibition's theme was water, and that's why they have chosen that wave pattern to represent, this topic in this room. There was the VIP lounge. So everything was just completely white, but we even had the floor was floating. There was a 2-inch or a 1-inch gap here, and the LED tiles reach down. The first row that you see here is actually slightly below floor level. So it was the idea to make the floor completely float, that you're almost like on an ice shelf or an ice float coming into the room. And the same on the ceiling. The LED tiles reach into the ceiling. There's like a 1-inch gap behind the ceiling. Another version at Ingenuity Festival in Cleveland. This was the old Christian Science reading room. An outdoor version, 2009, in Lviv, it's the second biggest city in the Ukraine, and obviously completely different context now. It's like a medieval core of the city, and it's outdoors. The sound was projected with these big speakers, but you didn't see them, so it's very subtle beep at night, and nobody complained. It was great. And especially like in the Ukraine, like this kind of art is just completely unknown. I mean, people had no idea that this exists. I also gave a presentation. They had like very strange questions, which is great because it was challenging me. Completely different context. 2009, Nuit Blanche in Toronto. Toronto, like once a year, has like a festival. It's just one night. It's called Nuit Blanche, the White Night. And White Night means in French, basically, you stay up all night. So the whole downtown Toronto is shut down, and there are different performances and concerts and art installations. It's just for one night. And I've chosen this advertising wall for a temporary structure in a distribution corridor between different subway stations as a shopping center. And so there's all those like completely ridiculous advertising here is for a phone company. And I just slanted 2 bands of LEDs and just put them here, and the speaker was also hidden. And it was quite amazing to see it in that context, because it reads obviously completely different than like in an abstract gallery space or like historic, medieval architecture, and suddenly in this advertising space. Okay, here, so far the last version of Speed Shift was in the University Gallery in Bowling Green, where I actually live. I don't live in the gallery, but I live in Bowling Green. And have very good relationships with the art department. And they have a very nice two-story exhibition space, and I just installed this piece there. This actually this was my crew at the time. Okay, now I can play the video. Oops, maybe not. Yes. Oops. No, that's not my video. I think there's something playing in iTunes. Help me. Up. Macintosh, that's all I say. This is live sound.
It's kind of similar.
I mean, it's edited for the sake of the video, but those are the beeps. It's the real sound.
And the volume is about the same.
It's about the same, yes. It's very soft. Okay. Thank you. Now you have to talk.
Okay. So we have a microphone over there.
Oh.
And
Maybe if you turn the lights on, it's easier to see people.
Hello? Oh, I just can't hear myself. It seems like a lot of your works are very successful because they exist on a certain scale, which is very large. And I'm curious, did you have work that predates this that kind of anticipates the ones you showed us?
Yes.
Suddenly all
I
of a sudden-
didn't start making art in 2006. No, no. I did, and I do smaller work. And at this point, actually, I almost prefer to do smaller work because sometimes it gets very exhausting, those big projects, because it's a little bit art by committee. If you work in a public art context with, like from, public talking and committee members and, somebody, why can't it be pink with green dots, And I said, well, I don't do pink, And then there are lawyers involved and engineers and stamps and city permissions and UL certified power supplies. So I'm always jealous of the artist with the easel in the attic or something. So I try to go in that direction, at least partially.
Hi, I saw you had some reflections on the floor. Have you played with reflections much?
Not consciously. There are a lot of those things, and that's music was also in that, has to be mentioned in that context. You have to be, at least I want to be aware that I'm not doing effects, because of course I could do visual effects, I could use mirrors, I could use water, I could use fog, I could use sound, I could use incense, I could use naked ladies or boys, whatever. But then it becomes effects, then you make just calculated effects. It reflects, and the reflecting is cool. I'm not interested in cool. The reflection happen anyway. And most of that happens in your retina or in your ear or in your body when you're in space. If you just make like a, just some little Halloween show, go for it. It's just not what I do.
Talking about the last piece where you incorporated an audio element or let's call it music to it, what was your experience? For the 3 minutes I was listening to it, I found it pleasant, very pleasant. You probably had opportunity to experience that for way longer periods of time, and there is a problem with one problem of a musical composition or audio in general can be that it can become annoying over time, right?
Yeah.
How was it here? Did that change after being 2
No,
hours?
no. It's not just with audio. Most of my work is pleasant, and I think pleasant is nothing wrong. I'm interested in beauty, and beauty is pleasant, and so why not do it on a large scale? Why not do it with long time stretches? But it becomes monumental, and even that can be like frightening in a good way. It's like if you hear Beethoven's whatever number 10 or any or even like Giorgi Ligeti at the 2001 soundtrack, one of the other heroes of 20th century music. That music is frightening, but frightening in a very beautiful way. It's overwhelming beauty, and you lose yourself, and that's my aim in my work. Like, I'm not interested in myself. I'm not expressing myself. I express structure, and yeah, I'm not trying to shock people. Just that doesn't interest me. There are people that are really good at it, and it's fine by me. It's just not what I do. There was one experience at the Whitney Biennial, like they were all completely concerned that the neighbors would go bonkers about the piece and and call all the little rich lawyers on the Upper East Side. And I had a clause in my contract that I'm not reliable for traffic accidents, for example. The museum has to take care of it, otherwise I can't do such a piece. There was not a single call from a neighbor. They called when they removed it. Were asking why are you removing it? So it's like great. It's for example, with the soundtrack, initially experimented just with noise, different like little noise patterns, just white noise that are shifting apart, and it was just too disturbing over long stretches of time. If you can hear that first drumming piece that I played, I don't think you want to hear it for 2 hours. But in a stretch of 9 minutes where I just say I go through this intense experience, like you go to a sauna or something, or you do jump into a cold river, you don't want to swim in a cold river for like 20 minutes, but to jump into a cold river can be an amazing experience, you know. And all those borderline threshold experiences, they have to be timed right, you know. And my aim is just to time them right. That's why I have to put pieces out there and see if they go wrong or right. And sometimes they go wrong, you know. So this is Jennifer Callan from Ace Gallery. So
hi, I just wanted to add that as Erwin showed you in one of the slides, he installed a speed shift at Ace Gallery Beverly Hills, and I had the pleasure of experiencing that sound every day. And it was upstairs for months. And I could hear it from downstairs, but I found it the opposite of annoying. I found it soothing, kind of inspiring, comforting, all positive.
Well,
I never cursed Erwin. Damn it, get this. It was like every day I enjoyed hearing it, and I missed it when it was gone.
Elevator music in its best sense, you know. There's nothing wrong with elevator music if you know if it's. Yeah. If it's elevating, yes, yeah.
I guess when I saw the fetch piece, I just imagined you must have been so excited.
I was
during that whole process.
I was completely beyond myself.
Yeah,
but I had like 3 shows at the same time. Like the speed shift was installed at the same time, like literally at the same time. Yeah. So it was, you know, but I was basically just doing spreadsheets, to be honest. That's what I mostly did.
Well, you must be excited about doing spreadsheets.
I like spreadsheets. No, but then of course I did all the programming, because then we made like on like 2 4x8 panels. I rigged up a simulation of the 3 tiers, and I sat in an office next door of the museum. I was just sitting there, programming and seeing what's happening. But then I had to go outside and make sure everything is happening outside. And then you have to adjust the program and see, you know, I was just running around with a laptop with a wireless DMX controller, just seeing that the colors are right and stuff. So it's...
one thing, it seems like there's kind of a lot of pieces in one, and maybe it's tempting to do that because you have this great opportunity. But I sort of wonder about that. In the fetch piece, you had so many variations, but I enjoyed them all.
You mean variations in terms of like the color sequences?
Yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, there would be 2 approaches. Either you make a sequence that you can comprehend at one glance. You go there, or you drive there, or you cycle there, and see, oh, it's going from here to there, it goes from yellow to blue, and then the other layer does the same. There would be one approach, but I thought, well, I want to see it more like, you know, as a narrative, an abstract narrative. And so at the beginning, the video obviously is not edited as it's not linear editing. So, but you saw like this one sequence where everything was just flashing. So, and I called it like the birth of the universe sequence. Just, you didn't hear that. It was just like, I had to make my own narrative, you know. So it was just blink, 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 blink. So more and more blinkies blinked on, just in one color. And then more colors came in. And then you see it at the end of the video, suddenly everything just flashed red. So when there's this, you know, when those fireworks become just completely out of control, everything just completely becomes soothing red. It then fades very slowly over 2 minutes to blue. And then once the blue fades out, the first like shooting stars come. So I had to just make this whole sequence. Well, it's an abstract narrative. It's like any abstract film, you know, like early abstract film or any of those things. But it always, of course, has to work on this big scale, you know, because it looks different on the computer, it looks different on a simulation, but you have to be able to stand out there and feel that draw. And you work with different sequences. So should it be a linear movement, or should it like accelerate or decelerate? I mean, there are micro decisions. There are many, many micro decisions. I mean, you know it from your work. It's like you just see this big thing, but there are like so many millions of, you know, small steps involved.
We're going to have 2 more questions. So I have a question. Right now in our new white gallery, we have a show up called Interference. And I was curious, when I saw your structures, and when you placed it in front of that advertisement, do you feel like what you're doing is a form of interference? Your structure is an interference on the structure that you've been commissioned to work with?
By definition, yes. As soon as it's like quantum physics, you know, as soon as you're present or as soon as you watch it, you know, you change the situation. And of course, the more you interact on a just in terms of quantity, the more you interfere, you know. But some people call it architectural intervention, you know. It's like, these are all just funny terms. I mean, it's just, of course, when you work outside in the public, then it's a conscious decision to work in the public. And if I've chosen that advertising wall, it was a conscious decision to choose that advertising wall because I found it hilarious. Those like blown up faces with the funny cell phones, you know. And it was so, because the picture was so highly pixelized and rasterized because of the, you know, those large scale printing techniques. And then I just slanted everything. It's like, they're just very spontaneous decisions that are, you know, just, yeah, at the end it's just fun in a way, like to play with the context of the piece that you don't experience like in a museum setting or in a gallery setting.
Absolutely. And so do you feel like you make an entirely new structure when you do these?
I don't know. It's like, it's really hard. I mean, what is new?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know that this is burning, but Erwin, several years ago I saw an installation, several installations you did at the Ace Gallery, the Beverly Hills Gallery, and one of them in particular was in one of the upper rooms, and I think it was blue. But
the blue structures, yeah.
Yes, and it was a very much a spatial defining experience. And very interesting to sort of circulate through and so on. So it was very intense as a spatial experience. And I contrast that with, for instance, the Toronto installation. So my question is, what direction are you going next?
Oh, both ways. No, it is. If you're interested in the phenomenology, of course you need a very controlled environment. So it has to be a white box or a white cube. Or I did a stage set for a body traffic at the Los Angeles Dance Company by a Belgian choreographer. And of course it wasn't a black box theater, so you could completely control everything. And that was very good experience also with the body in space. And of course, you know, if you have a controlled environment in a beautiful gallery, it becomes, you're not distracted by, you know, the advertising or the people or the cars. It's a completely different experience. I mean, right now I'm a little bit heavy on the public art side, and I'd rather go a little bit back in the other direction because, as you know, architect, from your experience, it's like you have to deal with so many extraneous factors that have nothing to do with what you're actually interested in. And so right now I just want to cut those extraneous factors back a little bit. Well, thank you.